everybody. Welcome to the Training, Learning, and Development community. Happy Tuesday to you. Today, we have Anja Hartleb-Parson, who came to me with kind of a unique topic, something that we've never covered here at the Training, Learning, and Development community. And it's something that I'm really, really grateful to be having a casual conversation with Anja about. Anja is going to talk about her experiences living and working with autism. She's an L&D data analyst and trainer. You probably have seen her on the broadcast in the past. She has some extremely popular videos, like on YouTube. One of her videos in particular about data is just easily one of my highest ranking view count videos, and I get comments on there, and I just see that people continue to watch it all the time. So Anja is definitely an excellent supporting member for the community, and now we're going to be talking about her living and working with autism, which she's very passionate about speaking, and I'm so glad to have this opportunity to have this talk with you, Anja. So what I'm going to do is I'll just kind of let you take it away, and then I'll pop up whenever we have questions or anything to follow up with. I'm going to be writing my own questions down. And with that, maybe why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, and just, I know you do it every time, but talk a little bit about your background first.
Sure. So oh gosh, my background's very diverse because I tend to dabble in a lot of things. Actually, dabble is kind of an understatement. And I started out originally when I went to college in philosophy and psychology, and then went into political theory and biopolitics in graduate school, and later on into organizational theory. And for the first sort of almost 10 years of being a professional, I focused mainly on nonprofit startups. And that allowed me to just really take part in almost every function that you can think of that there is in an organization. And then, due to circumstances, I took a job in financial services, which is what I'm doing right now. But through all of that, I realized that I really like working with data, and I really enjoy the people development piece in particular. And when I found the L&D community sometime last year, I thought to myself, well, maybe there is some room here for talking about data, because when we, train people, when we try to develop people on the company's dime, we do want to make sure that we get the most out of it. And to my astonishment, I realized that the data piece is something that the L&D community is seemingly still struggling with. So I kind of made that my, I don't know, you could say calling card. So that's kind of my professional background. When I say I've dabbled in a lot of different things, it's not just the people development and the data piece, it's science, technology, anything that tends to be very research focused, where there is a lot of logical and rational thinking involved. And that's, for the most part, really, at least from what I can tell, not unusual with people who have autism. That as an introduction. I do want to take like 5 minutes to talk about what autism is, because I think there are some misconceptions out there, and it's not well understood by the general population. But this isn't a scientific talk because I honestly am not hugely well versed in the science of autism. And I'll talk about that in a moment, why. But at any rate, autism is considered a pervasive neurological disorder. And most likely it has genetic components to it. There are explorations into the epigenetics and the environmental factors that can play a role, and there are a whole bunch of different theories as to how autism arises. But the long and short of it is that it is a very individual disease in the way, or disorder, I should say. I don't want to call it a disease, a disorder in the way that it shows up in a person. And we used to distinguish between high and low functioning autistic people. The more I have thought about this, the less I like that terminology. And someone pointed out, let's talk about it more in terms of support level needed. And I think that's a better way of putting it. It's less, we're talking about a disability and more talking about individual differences. But autistic people need varying levels of support, and it can be very intensive, in the sense that the person cannot live by themselves and take care of themselves. Two, they are very very independent. Like me, for example, they can hold down a job. They can be actually very successful from a professional perspective. Since it is so individual, you might wonder if there are any things in common between people who have autism, and there definitely are. So, and I want to kind of talk about how that shows up in me. The best way I can explain what happens in my autistic brain is that the stuff that has to do with people is very difficult for me. You give me a mathematical equation, and while I'm not terribly while I'm not super great at math, I am fairly good, and I can understand pretty complex equations. If you give me a person or a behavior or a social conversation, things are a lot different. Partly it is because I have difficulty taking social cues or understanding them. I have difficulty reading people and reading between the lines and fully grasping something that concerns emotions. And in a way, it's sort of a constant enigma for me. Enigma wrapped in a riddle sort of situation. Interestingly enough, that was probably one of the reasons why I gravitated towards psychology and philosophy early on in my career, because I thought to myself, okay, I can study this and I can figure this out. Famous last words. But it did help me develop a certain level of social competence enough so that I can pass as a normal person. This is something you're probably going to hear a lot from autistic people. They try as much as possible to camouflage their autism, particularly when they think it is going to be to their detriment. And this doesn't necessarily mean that physical harm is coming to them or anything like that. It's just that, you know, in a work environment, you might not want people to know because you don't want to be considered less capable or less competent as other people. So the people piece, I'm just going to call it the people piece, is the thing that is the most difficult for me. But the way I adjust is by trying to mask those difficulties as much as I can. And so having a lot of I tend to approach these subjects very intellectually. So it doesn't necessarily look like I have difficulties in that respect. But in my personal life, this is a lot more difficult, and it's always been extremely difficult for me to form personal relationships, friendships, to even just have a lot of normal social interactions. And I'm using the term normal here loosely. Another interesting thing about that I can definitely relate to, but I hear from a lot of autistic people, is that they, for the social piece in particular, they remember just watching a lot of movies and shows as kids and kind of taking in how people were behaving when it comes to emotions from that. And I remember that very distinctly. In movies and books, there is often a lot of explanation around a person's behavior and the inner dialogue being exposed, and that can be extremely helpful. Of course, in real life, you can't read people's minds, so it makes it a lot more difficult. And then, of course, in movies, you also have a lot of sort of accompanying pieces, like the background music, for instance, or the scenery, the way something is shot, that gives you additional information that you can process. Yeah, if life was like a movie. Another thing that happens a lot with autistic people is, and if you look at the DSM-5, it's one of the characteristics that describes the disorder, is a certain amount of rigidity and obsession in daily life. And rigidity with respect to, it could be routines, the way things happen on a daily basis for them, or the way they try to make things happen. It could be with respect to change in general. It could be with respect to food. Food is a very common area where autistic people have trouble, as with other sort of sensory pieces, such as noise, light, touch also. In fact, eating disorders, or at least diagnosed eating disorders, are fairly common, and especially women with autism. I think the percentage I read was something like 30% of them have some form of eating disorder. Often it's anorexia. And this goes to the point of diagnosis, because sometimes, or maybe even many times, that eating disorder may be diagnosed, whereas the autism is not, which is in this case perhaps more at the heart of the matter than the eating disorder in and of itself. Obsessive interests is another one of those categories that may or may not show to an outside person, but and it also differs between men and women. But it could be something like collecting something of a certain kind, an object or item. It could also be obsessive behavior, like repeatedly doing something. We call it stimming, and that can be a very soothing activity. So you might play a song over and over and over and over again. You might just revert to a particular physical position a lot. You might line up things on your desk in a very specific way and always revert back to that, and as a way of taming the chaos, I guess, that goes on inside your head, and the chaos that the world seems to be in, at least for the autistic person. Although I think regular people probably perceive the world as sometimes chaotic as well. And all these things, when you take them together, lead to a level of exhaustion and fatigue on a daily basis that can be quite unmanageable. So autistic people tend to expend a lot of mental energy, and so being tired, being burned out, and there's actually something called autistic burnout, and needing to retreat in whatever way the person prefers. And that includes completely isolating yourself, perhaps from social interaction and contact, is pretty common. Now, if you couple that with just the regular demands of daily living, say, for instance, in my case, having a family and having a job and having to manage a household and all these other things, you can probably see that it's just an extremely overwhelming condition. On top of that, women tend to be misdiagnosed, and partly that's because for the longest time, experts kind of thought that autism only could occur in men, and hence they only studied men or males. Well, we know now that that's obviously not true, but there are a lot of women who get diagnosed later in life, which was the case for me. And initially, if they're being treated for mental health conditions, might receive diagnosis like, for instance, the eating disorder, depression, generalized anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, or personality disorders. And all those had been on the table with me at some point. And while depression and anxiety there are comorbidities with autism, it's the root that's going to be different for an autistic person, and hence the kind of support that you might give to that person to better live as a person with autism. I notice that I'm sort of going back between saying an autistic versus a person with autism. I personally don't have a preference, but just know that the community the self-advocacy community, there can be some strong opinions about that, as there can be about with respect to the characterization of autism itself. Not so much scientifically, but the type of language we use, whether we talk about it more in a negative sense or in a positive sense. And the neurodiversity movement is more of a way of talking about conditions like autism, ADHD, etc., as differences in the brain and in the person that certainly may require support, but on the whole, it should be, we should work toward acceptance and, in a way, for lack of a better word, normalizing rather than stigmatizing. So the same issues that the community of disabled people generally faces, people with autism face as well. What do I do at work that helps me deal with these autistic characteristics? I actually have worked remotely for the longest time, and that's been something that alleviates a lot of stress for me, not being in an office environment. Or when I am in an office environment, having literally an office to close my door and shut people out. I tend to be very conscious about the time that I spend socializing, and it could be meetings, it could be one-on-one conversations, it could be the chat at the lunch table, not that I go to the lunch table, or when you're meeting someone in the hallway. I tend to also schedule, I call that just me time, but I just block time off on my calendar where I say no interruptions, or, I'm just working on something, which typically is the case, but sometimes I just need that time also to just recharge. Especially when you have a meeting where a lot of stuff happens between people. Maybe there is a lot of heated discussion, or sometimes, just people having differences of opinion, perhaps being aggressive. All those different things that happen interpersonally can be very, very exhausting for me. They may be more annoying to other people, but to me, they're physically and mentally draining. I also, it's hard sometimes to keep a schedule, or just a set way of doing things. So when I can't do it at work, I sort of end up compensating for it in my personal life somehow, because I'm just very prone to that sort of rigidity that I talked about earlier. I was asked at one by someone who I think was at my data talk, the last one I gave about how one in learning and development can better support people with autism. And I'm going to tell you straight up that I don't have a good answer to that, because when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So a lot of it probably hinges upon creating an environment in which people with disabilities in general, but also people with autism, can more safely reveal their needs. And It goes honestly beyond saying my door is always open, or we pride ourselves in diversity and inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. Because those are all laudable goals, but the reality often falls far short of that. And I'm not saying that to be dismissive of those initiatives. I'm just, in part recounting my own experience, but also acknowledging how difficult it is in our society to help people who are in one way or another different from the norm. So I think we can do better. Let's put it this way. We can always do better. But there has to be a level of time commitment and energy commitment on the people who have the power and means to provide accommodations, and to do so without us having to explain all the time why we're asking for things. For the longest time, that's partly the reason why I didn't say I need X, Y, and Z or ask for accommodation, because I felt like I would have to explain it and that the explanation would not be very easily understood. And, when you're in an environment where you have to fill out requisition forms for certain things in terms of accommodation, you kind of feeling like, this is just too much. This is not worth the additional trouble and possible exposure that I might be going through. I hope that kind of makes sense. I did forget one other thing that is very prevalent among people with autism, and it sort of speaks to this people piece that I was talking about. Eye contact is extremely painful, more so mentally, but sometimes also physically. I cannot explain why, but this has always been the case for me. I would rather get an injection or go into surgery than be forced to look at people in the way that is socially accepted. That sounds very dramatic, but it is so intense for me. I figured out some ways to work around this. Like, I will maybe pick a spot on the wall behind someone or something so it looks like I'm looking at that person, but not to reveal my covert secrets here. But it's just something that I probably have been able to least work around, so to speak, or that tends to be more obvious. In fact, I've had several people point this out, obviously not knowing that I had autism, and at the time I didn't even know I had autism. And, just trying to be helpful and saying, you will be more credible if you can look people in the eye while you have a conversation. And I think that is pretty true. I mean, when someone always averts their gaze, we do kind of, maybe perceive them as shifty or dishonest. And this whole industry of reading body language, well, let me just say, it's kind of a bit of a nightmare for autistic people. Anyway, another one that I forgot to mention is it's called selective mutism. It happens to me a lot when I'm either in meetings or when I'm in an interpersonal situation that may be more stressful. I can't talk. I have a whole bunch of words in my head but I cannot even form a coherent thought. Excuse me, coherent thought. I probably still manage to mask it somehow a lot of times by, for instance, I will say, I'm thinking about this, or let me contemplate this and get back to you, or et cetera, or I can't focus on this right now. Can we talk about this later? But that doesn't necessarily always work, of course. I feel like I talked for 30 minutes, and I'm going to be honest with you. My head is still pretty jumbled. I'm not sure if I made a whole lot of sense about this, but
Hey,
in
Anja,
a nutshell,
can I
go
interrupt
ahead.
a little bit here?
Yeah.
Yeah, you made perfect sense. Just wonderful. I think that people are sharing in chat and sharing some of their stories, and I think that I've always found you to be incredibly articulate, probably more articulate than most of the guests that I have here. So I really appreciate that. I'm wondering, can I just ask you some of the questions that are in our Q&A area
Yeah.
for you? Yeah, is that okay? Okay. So Craig is asking, my son is on the scale, and I'm just asking questions to make connections to what you're dealing with. Did you have auditory sensitivity issues? And if so, did you evolve out of them, or did you find solutions to those issues or workarounds?
Yeah. My sensory issues are primarily auditory, sight, and touch. The auditory piece, I have some workarounds, and some of them are very low tech. I wear earplugs. I wear earplugs a lot when I'm overwhelmed, or when my husband bought me these noise canceling headphones, I thought I had entered paradise. It was just really, really good for me to be able to drown out things that were just too much for me to have in the background, even just listening to. Did I grow out of them? I think they may have changed, but I didn't really grow out of them. The same with touch and sight. I didn't really grow out of them, but I've learned to just kind of manage them a little bit more. And it's easier to say as an adult, don't touch me. Not that I necessarily say it that way, but you know what I mean, than as a kid. And that's the challenge that my own children, of course, also face. I have twins with autism, and they're completely nonverbal. So for people like that, the people around them have to be extra attentive and tune into them as best as they can to figure out why they are in distress. And I'm assuming that as a parent of an autistic child, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, and then Kim was asking, are you familiar with the idea of a highly sensitive person? She has that in quotation marks, highly sensitive person, and then maybe they're related. She has a link to a website here that has some research. I'm not sure if you have any comment on that.
I've heard about it. I can't remember any details right now. It's so if we take this example of sensory processing, this isn't just an issue that happens to or is a feature of autism. people can have sensory processing issues without being autistic. And I don't know much more about that, to be honest.
Okay. All right. And I got, let's see, one more question from Julia here. Let's see. How might onboarding a new hire be modified to draw out important information about the person, such as their need for quiet space and desire to avoid larger or louder meetings? What would be or have been acceptable inquiries from a colleague seeking guidance on how to make the work environment actually work?
This is a great question, and it's kind of a general question too, with respect to how to approach people who have disabilities, or in my case, autism, and ask them about their autism. So I'm a very direct person, and since it's already pretty difficult for me to read between the lines. It's better to be direct with me than diplomatic, if you know what I'm saying. But if you're in an onboarding situation, you could try to pinpoint some of those very common features that you mentioned and just ask, we try to be very accommodating to our employees because we want them to be happy and productive. Here are some things that you might need and that you think we should know about, and then list them. And even just opening that door to the conversation can elicit more comfort and information from the person with autism. It's all about sort of creating an environment in which the person is comfortable enough to talk about these things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I am also wondering about your education. You've got like a master's in political science and biopolitics, master's in organizational leadership, a BA in philosophy and psychology, and a data science graduate certificate. Um, I mean, how difficult was it for you to? You're educationally or academically, you're one of the more accomplished people that I know. Um, how did you manage to? What kind of tools did you use to be able to get through these programs? Was it just, just a lot of hard work, or do you find that, intellectually, academics is something that you're naturally inclined for?
Um, I think that in many ways, so remember very early on where I said I dabble a lot. This is probably one of my primary coping mechanisms, educating myself, because I feel like it gives me, for lack of a better phrase, a seat at the table. And it gives me credibility and it makes people listen. But it also helps me make sense of some things. So psychology and philosophy in particular, there is obviously a lot of discussion and research about human behavior. And I remember very distinctly several people commenting on the fact that I have such insight into human behavior, which I today find extremely funny. But it goes back to this piece about masking, right? That when you have enough intellectual knowledge, then you can, you can. I don't want to talk. I don't want to say fake it. It's just that a lot of times you can do what is necessary or contribute what is necessary without drawing too much attention to yourself in a without seeming different. I can't put it any different than that. But I really enjoy all those things. It's my mind, when it's occupied with these things, it's not occupied with having to process the things that are much more difficult for me. And so in a certain sense, it's almost a reprieve. And probably that's why it has come so easily to me.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. And I want to mention too, it looks like a lot of the conversation in chat is focused on 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 people like, like Craig's son and Eric, Eric's son, all autistic. Kevin Marandino is autistic, and he's dropped some comments in chat. Um, is there any type of guidance, or where do you go, like if you're looking for, I don't know, like advice or other ways to cope, or just or just dealing with the disorder? Is there anywhere that you go, or any tools that people can reference, maybe just to share some resources?
Um, so I know there's a huge self-advocacy community. I can't think of the main website right now. There are some things that I found helpful from a knowledge perspective is there's a website called Spectrum News, and what is it? The Autism Science Foundation, I think. Yeah, Autism Science Foundation. I'm not part of any of these groups because I haven't got, let's put it this way, I haven't gotten to that point in my managing my autism yet. I'm still sort of trying to figure out what the heck happened when I got diagnosed. And so there are many resources where you can connect with people. I mean, I know Facebook is pretty big, and local support groups, particularly in areas that have very good services for people, and particularly children with autism. They tend to also be pretty good on the support group front. It's much more difficult in areas where the social and the healthcare system isn't great. And I'm unfortunately in one of those areas when it comes to special needs, that is.
Craig has posted a couple links, autisticadvocacy.org, autismsciencefoundation.org. I think you had mentioned that one. Kevin posted some that one that he found that it's good, reframingautism.org.au. How long ago, when were you diagnosed?
I was diagnosed. You guys are not going to believe this. I was diagnosed 2 months ago.
Oh, wow.
And that was me going for an official diagnosis. After my kids were diagnosed, that was probably that was the first clue to me that I might have autism. But I did not have the emotional stamina at the time to go further down that route. Because holy crap, I have 2 children with autism, and that took several years to work through. And then after I just had sort of sign after sign, I thought, okay, maybe I will go and talk to someone. And I sought out a professional who specializes in women and autism, because at the time I already knew that the potential for misdiagnosis is much greater with women, or underdiagnosis also. And so I sought someone out who knew how autism might show itself differently. For instance, women tend to have, when it comes to the obsession piece, much more socially acceptable obsessions, if that makes sense. I remember one person on YouTube talking about how she collected Barbie dolls, and everybody was like, well, that doesn't seem strange. Well, if you knew how I collected them. Anyway, and the diagnosis was not even anywhere borderline or ambiguous. It was pretty obvious from the tests. Yeah, that's my story. So being a 40-year-old woman getting diagnosed with autism is not an unusual story, I've learned.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, that's I guess that changes everything. It's probably like having a massive impact on your life and how you're looking at things moving forward. Let's see. I think I have one more question here. Okay. So Christine is asking, can you talk about the process of getting diagnosed as an adult woman, if
Yeah.
you're comfortable with talking about that?
So since I don't live in an area where we have specialized medical professionals, I actually had to go to some of those big psychology resource websites. And I think the one I went to was Psychology Today, and I looked at professional psychologists trained in autism. And some of them would also list subspecialties. Like, for instance, this person specializes in children with autism. This person specializes in adults in autism, or late age diagnosis, or in my case, women in autism. So it didn't take me terribly long. But if you're in an area, for instance, say up in Madison, Wisconsin, which has a whole center at the University of Madison dedicated to autism, I would go to a place like that if I had it available. And COVID, to some extent, made some of these things easier because you could get remote appointments or virtual appointments, which before COVID was certainly not the norm. And so you have access to professionals outside of your geographic location, which I think has been a silver lining.
Oh, okay, no, that's great. That's some great advice. Let's see, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to add them. Otherwise, I think we're gonna go ahead and get wrapped up here. I want to say, Anja, I think that the conversation in chat and seeing Craig, Ken, Eric, Kevin, just Julia, all the folks in chat that have shared that if there's anything that TLDC can do to help, provide some level of support or guidance or anything like that, just as a resource, please let me know, because I think that this is an important conversation to have within the community, and I'm really, really grateful that you're willing to share all this stuff. Oh, let's see here. Craig is asking, was there any ADHD in your diagnosis as well?
No, it's actually another ADHD and autism, sometimes kind of go hand in hand. I don't really have any of the quote unquote common signs of ADHD. My son, however, probably has some signs. So but sometimes it's just with these things so hard to parse out what's what. And at the end of the day, whether we get an additional diagnosis, the support that we need is going to look a certain way either way. And I think it's more important to understand, to have some peace about what's happening inside of yourself, maybe give it a name, maybe see that there are other people who do deal with that, and see how other people are able to live happy lives with it. So I hope I don't want to sound dismissive about ADHD. I'm just trying to make the point that um, it's there are sometimes so many moving parts that it's really hard to attach a bunch of different, make sense, or to be more productive, I guess, in your life with having additional diagnoses. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. 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 I think that's, yeah, I think that's a great reply. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I want to let everyone know next month, we do have Anja coming back to talk about this one. I find totally fascinating. What philosophy can teach us about learning, which I'm sure is going to be really, really interesting. I love that you're making that connection. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Anja, thank you so much for sharing this. Probably one of the more memorable broadcasts that I think we've ever done here at TLDC. And again, everybody, if you have, send me a message if there's anything at all that the community can do to help support you, or just even doing more discovery or anything like that within what we do as L&D professionals, let me know. I'd be happy to cover more stuff. So Anja, thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, definitely feel free, you all, to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I think that I've noticed about myself, the more I'm learning about myself, as if that ever stops, but that the next step that I want to take is to be more involved in the advocacy piece, but primarily also to form some more interpersonal relationships that help me with people who are more like me, if that makes sense, so that I feel like I have a better sense of being supported, or I can talk to someone who is like me, as opposed to, well, always talking to my husband, who's probably sick of it by now. But you know what I'm saying? Like talking to people who are very empathetic, but who don't necessarily understand what actually is happening in my brain.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I posted your LinkedIn link there in chat, and yeah, so I guess folks can reach out to you there if they're interested in following up. And yeah, thanks again, Anja, for bringing this conversation to light. I loved it, and if there's anything that I can do or the community can do to help you out, let me know.
I will. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you all for your kind questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Okay, and yeah, we'll see everybody next time. This has been a great discussion. Take care, everybody. Have a great week. Thanks again, Anja.
Bye.
Bye.